And it's a great pleasure to me to welcome our friend and colleague, Dr. Tim Grass, who is Senior Research Fellow at the College and has done various things with us and for us over a number of years as a leading church historian. Tim is a special expert in Brethranism, the history of the Brethren movement, having been brought up in that movement himself, and written a major work on that. No.
I don't belong to them.
You don't belong to them?
I just wrote like an insider.
You wrote like an insider. You did it so well, obviously. Forgive me for that.
You wouldn't be the first to have fallen into that one.
I thought you told me you hadn't.
No, I'm not.
Well, I better look at you to make sure the rest of the information I give is correct. One of the great Brethren scholars who Tim has written about is the scholar you may well have heard of, F.F. Bruce, the great New Testament scholar, and Tim has written the biography of him, which has just come out in the last 2 or 3 years. So Tim is involved in a variety of things, and networks and so on, including working in evangelical orthodox dialogue, and that is going to be the subject of this paper today, which we look forward very much to hearing. Evangelicals and Eastern Christianity, patterns of engagement. So I think before I put my foot in it any further, we will pray for Tim as he comes to speak to us. Lord, we thank you for Tim and for his work in church history, and not just that, but his involvement in the promotion of understanding between Christians of different groupings around the world. And we pray that you will bless him now and bless us as we listen to him and discuss together, that we may grow in our understanding of our fellow Christians and may be able to work together more effectively with others and see the way that you are working and you want to work among us in your world. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
It may be helpful if I explain in starting where I'm coming from. As Stephen intimated, I've been involved in dialogue between evangelicals and Eastern Orthodox churches since about 1996 or 7, about as long as I've been here actually as an associate tutor, and that's been both in the UK and internationally. I've also had the privilege of teaching in several Baptist seminaries in Eastern Europe as a guest lecturer, which has been another opportunity to observe the way that these two traditions interact in a different part of the world. And I'm currently involved as a member of the steering committee of a dialogue between the two traditions, which is being carried on through the Lausanne movement. And I put the website for this dialogue on your handout because it's probably one of the best places to start, though I say it myself as shouldn't, if you're interested in finding out more about how these two traditions can do and have engaged. So I wanted to talk about the way that evangelicals have engaged with the Eastern churches, not just in recent decades, but over the last 3 centuries of evangelical history. This is very much work in progress. I've been commissioned to write a chapter on this theme for a book that's coming out from Ashgate in a year or 2. I'm wondering how it's all going to fit within a chapter because I think there's a book there, but there we go. Let me begin then by also offering some qualifications or clarifications. And firstly to say, well, who are we talking about? Obviously, I can assume a fair idea of what we mean when we're talking about who the evangelicals are, though it's worth just adding the point that for the purposes of this subject, I think we can include Pentecostals and Charismatics within the evangelical sphere. As far as Eastern Christianity is concerned, there are several main blocks that we need to include. There's the Eastern Orthodox, which would be those churches who accepted the Council of Chalcedon's definition of the person of Christ in 451, the Fourth Ecumenical Council. There are also the Oriental Orthodox, which is those churches who didn't accept that definition, although they are nowadays recognised as being sound in their Christology by the Eastern Orthodox. They used to be sort of slagged off as monophysites, but that was a bit unfair. And then there's a third block that I would include here. If you've ever watched McCulloch's TV series on the history of Christianity, you'll remember that he ended up somewhere in the west of China, finding these amazing monuments that testify to the presence of Christianity there by the 7th century. And the particular church which brought Christianity to that part of the world was the so-called Nestorians. Probably one of the greatest missionary churches the world has ever seen. Very little known about by us in the West. But I'm including them as another Eastern Christian bloc, though by the time the Evangelicals came on the scene, the Nestorians were much smaller than they once had been. Nowadays, you'll find that they're sometimes known as the Assyrians or the Church of the East. They only accepted the first two ecumenical councils, which is Nicaea in 325 and Constantinople in 381. So, that's what I mean by Eastern Christians. It's worth adding another qualification, which is that Orthodox Europe and the Middle East and Africa are, in significant respects, quite different. So, evangelicals were encountering Eastern Christianity in more than one context. In Orthodox Europe, if you've been to Romania, Russia, Bulgaria, Albania, wherever, you'll be aware that there is a large number of Orthodox Christian believers. Whereas in the Middle East and countries such as Egypt and Ethiopia and India, there are, for the most part, far fewer Orthodox, apart obviously from the Coptic Orthodox Church in Egypt. But the Orthodox churches in Islamic countries are much smaller. Oddly enough, though, the great majority of the scholarly work that's been done has been done on the ancient churches in the Middle East, not on the Orthodox churches in Europe and how evangelicals have engaged with those. There's lots of stuff about American missionaries in the Middle East and so on, but much less about how Western evangelicals have engaged with Orthodox Christianity in Europe. A third point to make in introduction is that the whole issue has been complicated by the presence and activity of Roman Catholic missionaries. Now, that's not to be anti-Catholic, but if you look at the way things developed historically, since the late medieval period, Roman Catholic missionaries had a key objective, which was to bring the ancient Eastern churches under the jurisdiction of the Pope. And the strategy that was often adopted involved allowing those churches to keep their Eastern liturgy, but accept papal supremacy. And those churches, often known now as Eastern Rite Catholics, but historically they were often called Uniate churches. Now, the activity of Roman missionaries was not entirely welcomed by the Orthodox, for obvious reasons. And so, when, a few centuries later, Protestant missionaries appear on the scene, Orthodox instantly start worrying, are they going to try the same trick as the Catholics did? And so there was an initial suspicion and apprehension, which evangelical missionaries therefore had to overcome when they arrived in Eastern countries. I would actually have liked to be able to include something on these Eastern Rite Catholics in what I'm going to say, but as yet I found nothing on how evangelicals have engaged with these churches, and we're talking about several million Christians here. It's another of those big holes in scholarship that you think, well, one day when I have time I might write a book about, but too much else to do and too many languages to learn. One final introductory point. I think it's significant that the initiative in contact with the Eastern churches has usually been taken by evangelicals, whether in the East or the West. And it may be worth reflecting on why that might have been. Now, I'm going to outline 7 main ways in which evangelicals have engaged with Eastern Christianity this morning, listed in roughly chronological order of their appearance. And the preacher in me has managed to come up with 7 C's. I hope they are not too, I was going to say contrived, but that's yet another C. But they may hopefully help us to get a handle on how things have developed over time. Curiosity, coming alongside, confrontation, church planting, conversation, cultural appropriation and cooperation. I think often things have developed from one into the next one, but I wouldn't want to lay down that things will always develop from 1 through to 7 in order, because that doesn't necessarily happen. Indeed, all those 7 patterns of relationship are evident today if we look at how evangelicals are engaging with Eastern Christianity. And that's what gives this theme its contemporary relevance, as I put in a flyer paragraph. Understanding where we are and how we've reached the point is essential if we're going to move on purposely from here. Good civil service principle. So I'm told. So then, to the first of those patterns of engagement, curiosity. Naturally enough, before Western Christians could think about how to engage with Eastern Christianity, they had to be interested in it to start with. You find that during the immediate post-Reformation era, the Eastern presence in the West and the Western presence in the East tended to be restricted to the diplomatic and trading communities. And as expats, these folk enjoyed special provision for their worship needs. So you have Anglican churches being set up in funny places, and other churches being set up in London, and vice versa, and so on. But as far as I've been able to discover, that presence in the world of the other rarely led to engagement with the wider church context of the host country. Easterners rarely engaged with Western Christianity, say in England. Westerners rarely engaged with Eastern Christianity in any serious and sustained way, initially. A little later on, of course, you have John Wesley in the 18th century. And nowadays in the dialogue scene, people often like to say, John Wesley was very interested in Eastern theology, and therefore it proves that we ought to be too, and that there's a compatibility between what evangelicals believe and what Orthodox believe. That, historically, does not stand up. Wesley himself appears to have read relatively little of the Greek Fathers. He edited some texts from the patristic period, yes, for the benefit of his preachers, but he took them from a secondary source, a volume, a sort of compilation edited by another High Anglican, because the 17th century High Anglicans were quite interested in Eastern theology. Moreover, Wesley edited, one might even say sanitised, the text that he published fairly significantly, so as to remove most of the distinctive Eastern ideas out of them. which makes you wonder why he bothered. And it's more likely than anything else that if you find echoes of Eastern Christian thought in John Wesley's writings or Charles Wesley's hymns, that what they're doing is not drawing it straight from Eastern sources, but drawing it from stuff that was in the air in the Church of England at that point. So I don't think we can say that there's a great deal of interest there on the part of John Wesley. There is more if you look across the water in Germany. The Pietist movement, the close cousin of Anglophone evangelicalism. And one of the great Pietists was August Franken, who died in 1727. Now, he founded an Oriental Institute at Halle to promote the study of Eastern Christianity and Eastern languages and to translate Pietist writings. But really it's the late 18th and especially the early 19th century and the rise of the missionary movement when you get the interest blossoming. And there's 7 factors culturally that were at work during that period which predisposed Western evangelicals to be interested in Eastern Christianity. The first is that this was an age of exploration, when learned societies and others sponsored expeditions to far-flung parts of the world. And the discoveries that were made, the contacts established, were mediated to the public through published travel logs. This is the sort of thing that people like William Carey were reading, Captain Cook and all the rest of it. And in fact there was a distinctive subgenre of these travelogues which you could give the label Christian researchers to. You know, missionary societies would send one of their representatives to do a tour through certain parts of the world, and on their return they would produce a book, sort of a travel diary almost. And through such means, the wider giving public became aware of the need for mission and the need for support of mission. So it was an age of exploration. As a result, there was, not just among the churches, but generally, a rise in interest in aspects of Eastern culture. Sort of everything from Turkish carpets upwards. Now there was a serious flaw in this interest. It's been described by recent scholars as Orientalism. And often what it did was to portray the East as degenerate, louche, lax, corrupt, and of course therefore quite a contrast to the sort of Victorian efficiency and the new minted evangelical uprightness that you'd find in the West. Too often the West was interested in the East, but in such a way as to look down on it, to see it as an object of pity. And that extended to Western attitudes towards Eastern Christianity. And I would say that in some quarters it's still present. Following on from these two, we see the growth of pilgrimage. Now, the words pilgrimage and evangelical, you don't often find in the same sentence. But 19th century saw the growth of transport links, shipping, the invention of steamships, railways as well. And if you remember, Thomas Cook was in fact a Baptist, and it wasn't too long before he was getting into the pilgrimage trade. And this obviously enabled increasing numbers of evangelicals to visit the Holy Land, the 7 churches of Revelation, Egypt, and other sites of significance for their faith. However, I don't think it opened them up to Eastern Christianity so much as hardened them in opposition to it. But now they had a bit more to go on. And I think there were 3 reasons why the increased contact actually worked negatively. Firstly, if you were a good Protestant, you didn't like the sort of worship that was going on in these churches. A classic example would be the Holy Fire ceremony at Easter. in Jerusalem. And of course, you also found, if you were in Jerusalem for Easter, that the various Eastern churches that were present there were not above resorting to fisticuffs to maintain their place and their rights and their significance in the scheme of things. And this, of course, was just not right if you were a Protestant. I think another reason why contact with the Holy Land and pilgrimage turned evangelicals against Eastern Christianity was that actually you also had a lot of Orthodox pilgrims coming to the Holy Land at the same time. You had Western and Eastern pilgrims, but they were probably looking for two different things. It's been suggested that the evangelicals wanted to step inside the world of the Bible so that its message could become more real to them. Whereas the Orthodox wanted to honour the holy sites as they had since developed, with all the buildings and all the palaver, as locations where God had once manifested himself among human beings. As one writer puts it, Protestants looked for the human Jesus, Orthodox for the transfigured Jesus. A third reason why evangelicals took against Eastern Christianity once they started making pilgrimages to the East was that they tended to look at what they saw through Western eyes. We said a little earlier that the Western interest in Eastern culture often was a sort of very condescending, pitying one. And they'd visit the Holy Land and they'd say, fascinating to go, but oh, how backwards and deprived it is now. It is poor, it is underdeveloped. And this is because, they said, it had rejected the grace of God. Only when the inhabitants turned to a pure form of Christianity would God's judgment be reversed, the land become fertile, and economic and political as well as religious reform along Western lines become possible. So, oh poor people, they're not like us, was the basic output. I don't think that's too much of a caricature. Another reason for the growth of interest was, of course, the 19th century growth in the science of textual criticism, stimulating the quest for biblical and patristic manuscripts. Now, many of these had been preserved in Orthodox monasteries. So you have people going on to Sinai and so on to look at the manuscripts there. Now, this curiosity continues into the 20th century. In the early 20th century, I think there was a missed opportunity for evangelicals to engage with Eastern Christianity. One of the big events of the early century was the Russian Revolution in 1917. Following that, large numbers of Russian intellectuals fled to the West. Paris became a particular centre for them. And in fact, Russian Orthodoxy saw quite a remarkable theological renaissance centred on Paris. Now, the presence of these intellectuals in the West could have provided an opportunity for Western evangelicals to say, well, who are these guys? What is this form of Christianity that they espouse? But I think the weaknesses that were evident in evangelicalism at that point meant that they were in no position to do so. Western evangelicalism in the 1920s was riven by controversy over fundamentalism. It was often very defensive and introverted. And so it was an opportunity that was there, but which Western evangelicals, British ones in particular, were in no position to take. You have to wait till pretty late on in the century for evidence of much Western interest in Eastern Christianity. Indeed, as late as 1980, the Lausanne movement could say of the Protestant missionaries who were then at work in Eastern Europe, there is hardly anyone well enough versed in Orthodox theology to make a meaningful approach possible. During recent decades, however, the situation has changed quite significantly. certainly at the academic level. And there's several aspects to that. You've got firstly the growing evangelical interest in patristic theology, as evangelicals have themselves been re-evaluating what it means to be evangelical. There's been something of a paradigm change within evangelical theology. And there's corresponding unsettlement. Who are we? Eastern evangelicals have developed a significant scholarly interest in Orthodox theology. They probably lead the field, actually, especially Romanian Baptists. More recently, the interest in Eastern Christianity has broadened from the field of patristics to include missiology. Evangelicals have become much more missiologically sophisticated in the last 25 years. And that sustained reflection has extended to an interest, or the beginnings of interest, in, well, how do the Orthodox do it? And how do the Orthodox think about it? So, growing interest in Eastern theology. A second reason for recent interest in Eastern Christianity is this ongoing quest for the New Testament church. When I was a teenage Pentecostal, great phrase that, we used to like to say, we sought to live in the New, we sought to be a New Testament church, and that was where it was at. Michael Hart once said to me that he thought the logical conclusion of the quest for the New Testament church was orthodoxy. They tell you that in America you can buy a car bumper sticker for your vehicle if you're Orthodox. And I really would love to get one. The Orthodox Church, preaching the gospel since AD 33. Because the Orthodox are portraying themselves as the New Testament church in direct continuity, never reformed, never a gap. They have just gone on through 2 millennia. And so some of them are saying, well, you evangelicals, you're looking for the New Testament church. Hello, we're here. A third reason for recent evangelical interest in Eastern Christianity has been, although not now, of course, the concern regarding the plight of Christians in the communist world. When I was growing up, every evangelical worth their salt was reading books about what it was like to be a Christian in Russia and elsewhere. People like Georgy Vince, 3 Generations of Suffering, Richard Wurmbrandt, Haran Popov, all these folk who produced paperbacks about what it was like to be a Christian under communist rule. And this interest, obviously much of the information was mediated to Western media through Keston College, and its founder Michael Bordeaux has talked about the ecumenism of the gulags. That Russian prison colonies were perhaps the first place where evangelical and Orthodox Christians had ever encountered one another on an equal footing. What that did was to show many of us in the West that the Holy Spirit was at work in believers whose ways of worship and distinctive doctrines we would have otherwise written off. We would have said, hey, these guys, they've got funny beards and cassocks and stuff, but they're real Christians, they're saved. Otherwise they wouldn't talk like they do. On the other hand, of course, as well as finding heroes of faith in communist-era orthodoxy, many evangelicals also found sufficient evidence to confirm to them that orthodoxy was fatally compromised by the negotiations it had had to undertake with the state in order to simply survive. Of course, Baptists in Eastern Europe also were tainted by the same criticism. Now, that belief that orthodoxy was compromised by sort of supping with the communist devil would have implications for how Westerners did mission after communism collapsed post-1990. We'll come back to that later. And then another reason why evangelicals have been interested more recently has been that there's been a trickle of high-profile conversions to orthodoxy. I'm apprehensive about using that word conversion. I prefer to use it as conversion to Christ, but there isn't another easy one that really we can come up with. Some of you may be aware of Michael Harper, used to be curate to John Stott at All Souls Lane Place, then became an Orthodox priest. Some of you will have come across Francis Schaeffer, the evangelical apologist who died in 1984. His son, who helped to set Francis Schaeffer on the sort of religious rights track that he espoused late in his life, actually later converted to Greek Orthodoxy, though I'm not sure that his arrival in the Orthodox Church was entirely welcome because he's a bit of a controversialist. And then there was, in the 1990s in the USA, a couple of thousand evangelicals who came over to Orthodoxy pretty much en bloc. Their leader was a man called Peter Gilchrist, who had been a high-ranking staff worker with Campus Crusade for Christ. And he basically had become fed up with the parachurch mentality of Campus, wanted something that was more churchly, so that he could move on from just evangelising people, a place to put them, and started looking for the New Testament church with a group of colleagues. And they decided to set up what they thought a New Testament church would look like. Cut a long story short, it actually, in their minds, looked very like Orthodoxy. Then, belatedly discovered, hey, there are others around who do it like we do. And they've been around for centuries. Wow. And eventually, after many trials and tribulations, they were received into the Orthodox Church. However, whilst there has been a significant increase in interest in Eastern Christianity, I don't know that that's had too much impact at the church membership level. And certainly, I don't think there's been too much interest in Britain in Orthodox immigration. And I find that quite interesting. It's a bit of a contrast to the way that Catholic immigrants were sometimes perceived. And I think one of the reasons is because Catholicism historically has been seen by the British nation as a threat. And I think the Catholics were at the back of the minds of some in the national anthem, confound their politics, frustrate their knavish tricks on the our hopes we fix and so on. But Orthodox were never seen as a threat in the same way that Catholics were. And there's perhaps been more apathy, might be the best word to use. Even though you would probably have an Orthodox community in this country of at least 600,000, probably more. And there are significantly sized Orthodox congregations within a few miles of college. But, even so, and even though more have been coming into this country with opening of borders as Eastern countries have joined the EU, there has still been relatively little serious engagement with the form of Christianity that many of these immigrants have espoused. We're on the back foot, I think. Okay, so that's the curiosity one. That's one of the longest patterns that I wanted to talk about. The second one I want to talk about is coming alongside the ancient churches. Go back to the rise of the missionary movement late in the 18th century. One of the driving factors in evangelical mission was their beliefs about the end times, their eschatology. And it was a very optimistic eschatology for the most part, often post-millennial, and therefore looking forward to a large-scale ingathering of souls before the return of Christ. And it seems that the emergent missionary movement was taking the first steps towards that large-scale ingathering. Moreover, if you looked around you at the end of the 18th century, from some angles, the millennium really did seem to be just around the corner. With the French Revolution in 1789 and the rise to power of Napoleon, one antichrist, the papacy, was tottering. The other antichrist, Islam, was seen as likely to fall soon after the papacy did, because the main representative of Islamic political power was the Ottoman Empire, which at that point was relatively weak. It really looked as if Antichrist in both forms was about to fall, and that missionaries could then expect a mighty harvest of souls. A harvest among the Jews, whose ingathering on the lines of Romans 11 was seen as presaging a wider turning to Christ, and a harvest among the Muslims. Now, this was the soil in which the first evangelical missionary societies came into being. There's two that I want to mention in particular. A British one and an American one. The first one is the Church Missionary Society, Anglican, which was active in the East from 1815. And the second one is the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, ABCFM, which was Presbyterian and Congregationalist and was active in the East from 1819. Now, to reach the souls held captive under Muslim domination, the early missionaries were convinced that the best agents would be not Western missionaries, but the ancient indigenous churches of those lands. But, it was said, they're in no fit state to do the job. Corrupt, sunk in despair and lassitude, as the result of centuries of Muslim domination. This desperate state that they were in was seen as a divine judgment on these churches for their unfaithfulness. And the churches were, as they stood, a hindrance to the spread of the gospel, because people were going to look at them and say, if that's what Christianity is about, I want nothing of it. So, before these ancient Eastern churches could be able to reach anyone, they would need to be renewed. And, of course, such renewal needed to take place, the missionaries thought, on evangelical lines. So, from the beginning of serious interaction between evangelicals and the Eastern churches, those churches were seen as stepping stones to reach Islam, and not initially so much as objectives in themselves. And I can offer you several examples. Time, I don't think, will permit my going through all of them, but it's worth mentioning the British and Foreign Bible Society, because after its founding in 1804, it gave rise to a host of similar local societies in various parts of Europe and the Near East. And fundamental to the vision of those who sought to translate and distribute the Scriptures was the belief that the circulation of the Scriptures in the vernacular languages would itself lead to spiritual renewal. It was an expression of the Reformation conviction that faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God, Romans 10:17. So the CMS established a bridgehead in Malta in 1815, which became very active in printing and distributing Bibles and scripture portions in various East European and Near Eastern languages. You do find that some local Bible societies were formed as well in these areas. The best known was one founded in Russia in 1812, which had strong Orthodox participation until it was closed down in 1826. Another example which shows how the coming alongside could sometimes break down is provided by the work of the CMS in India. In 1806, the missionary strategist Claudius Buchanan visited southern India, and in particular the Syrian Orthodox community in the Travancore region of the country. And he reported positively on this group, saying that they're relatively free from error. And a little later on, we have the CMS portraying the Syrian Orthodox as a Christian communion for whom we should feel sympathy because for so long they have been oppressed by Rome. Because the Roman missionaries had sought to bring the Syrian Orthodox under papal jurisdiction in the way that I mentioned earlier. And in fact, in 1599, that had happened, although the church had probably split. The Syrians were worried that these new missionaries would try and do the same things that the Catholics had done. But once they'd been reassured, the CMS found it had an open door and set about educating children, training clergy, translating the Bible. Indeed, in 1818, a synod of the Syrian Orthodox Church even instructed priests to conform their rites and doctrines to the teachings of the missionaries. However, the missionaries found that this church wasn't as beautiful as it had been painted. The moral state of the clergy left something to be desired. Their educational level wasn't great. And from the mid-1820s, the leadership of the church became increasingly hostile. And in 1836, relations between the Syrian Orthodox and the CMS were formally severed. And a separate CMS-supported church was set up, as well as a larger one, the Mar Thoma Church, some of you may have come across, which wanted to reform the Syrian Orthodox, but to do so itself rather than with missionary aid. And then another example, the Armenians and the Nestorians in Turkey and northwest Persia. These were churches which again were often presented in ways that resonated with evangelicals. Free of the excesses in terms of iconography and so on that you'd find in other Orthodox churches, and as needing strengthening and protection against the machinations of the evil Catholic missionaries. The Armenians were seen as noble, hard-working, enterprising. They were widely distributed throughout the Middle Eastern world, and it was thought that they would make highly suitable missionaries. So we cultivate them. And in addition, there was already a reform movement underway in the Armenian church. And therefore, when the missionaries arrived, in a sense, there was already an openness to the sort of things they were saying. And they found the doors opened to them. And then you have the Nestorians, who were rediscovered by the West around 1830. Now they were, I suppose you could say, the ecclesiastical equivalent of the coelacanth. You might remember the coelacanth was a fish which was thought to have become extinct 60 million years ago until somebody dragged one up in a net in the Indian Ocean in 1938, and more have been found since. Well, the Nestorians were sort of church equivalent. A living fossil, someone said, which it was necessary to study, to preserve, and finally to convert. The ABCFM thought it was well worth sending missionaries to them because of their extreme liberality towards other sects, their ideas of open communion, and their entire rejection of auricular confession. You have to remember that many 19th century evangelicals saw confession to a priest as one of the great evils of Roman Catholicism. The problem with the Nestorians was spiritual death rather than theological error. However, they themselves were in a situation where politically they were pretty weak, and their openness to Western mission was motivated in part by their need for political support from the West. But the ABCFM missionaries aimed to enable the church to reform itself rather than to create a separate one. And it wasn't for many years that a separate church among the Assyrians came into existence. Missionaries were able to justify their policy of not setting up a separate church on the basis that people were being converted, they were allowed to preach in Nestorian churches, and why do we need to set up another one? We can work well within the one that's already there, unlike many other countries where the ABCFM was at work. Well, time doesn't permit me to look at the other examples. But it's fair to say overall that while Eastern churches initially welcomed Western evangelicals, all too often this approach of coming alongside ran into problems, and missionaries were forced to move towards founding separate congregations for converts. Partly, yes, because Easterners opposed the missionaries and their message, but also because if converts accept evangelical views and are then excommunicated, you've got to provide a home for them. And not only so, but you've got to provide a home for any Muslims who, it was hoped, would convert to Christ. And there is also perhaps the need to do something tangible that supporters at home can acknowledge, shows them the mission is achieving something and is therefore worth giving to. I think part of the problem was that often early missionaries separated soteriology from ecclesiology. So they were concerned to see people saved, but they didn't always think as much as they might have done about what the implications might be for the church affiliation of the people who accepted their message. This separation of soteriology from ecclesiology is something that we as evangelicals are pretty familiar with because it's part of our heritage and it's a recurrent feature, right? You're wrongly. But in the West, whilst that might be acceptable, in the East, it just didn't make sense at all. And in time, some Western missionaries concluded, no, you can't. If somebody gets saved, then they need a church that enables them to express that experience of salvation, a church which allows that gospel of salvation to be preached, and so on. By the end of the 19th century, we find the ancient churches being bypassed. Missionaries increasingly engaging with Islam directly rather than seeking to renew the local churches so that they can do it. And in countries where the initial objective had been ultimately to reach the Muslim community, often in practice it turned out to be the nominal Christians who accepted the evangelical message. And so you would have these churches formed that actually 99% of their membership would have come from one of the external churches. So what you have is a bifurcation of approach. Rather than mission to the Eastern churches as a stepping stone towards mission to Muslims, you have mission to the Eastern churches on the one hand and mission to the Muslim community on the other. But the stepping stone argument is still heard. Recently as 1996, a guide to Eastern Christianity produced for evangelical missionaries asks this. If we are concerned that the non-Christians of these lands should hear the good news of Christ, can we ignore the ancient churches? Do we expect God to bypass them all and use only the witness of the small local evangelical minorities and foreigners? Or the Operation World webpage for Greece, where you have this prayer request. Greek Protestants acknowledge that proselytism is unnecessary, but that evangelism is. Greeks are more likely to experience new life in Christ through a revitalisation of the Orthodox Church than through Protestants drawing Greeks away from their Orthodox background. Pray for ways that allow evangelicals to urgently communicate the need for salvation while respecting the great legacy and heritage of orthodoxy. So it's an argument that's still around. But then the third pattern, we're getting on the short ones now. Confrontation. Generally speaking, it wasn't too long before those who accepted the evangelical message began to experience some form of opposition. particularly obvious in Eastern Europe, certain countries. And what that did was often to confirm evangelical missionaries in the belief that that is what the Orthodox Church is always like if it has the power. Here's one Brethren writer, G.H. Lang, who looked at Bulgaria in the 1940s and said, well, this is the Greek Orthodox Church in all times and in all places where it has power. And for him and others like him, you couldn't have fellowship with these priestly religious systems. You had to urge believers to separate from them. In every age, believers were a remnant, persecuted by the representatives of a so-called church in which Christianity and paganism were mingled. That's the argument, incidentally, that you will find throughout E.H. Broadbent's The Pilgrim Church, a book which some of you may be familiar with because it's been constantly reprinted, and which was a seminal text for some of the folk in the Restoration movement of the 1980s. I remember it being widely recommended among the sort of Bryn Jones churches. So you get the confrontation, and it's small wonder then that some evangelicals actually welcomed communist rule when it began in Russia, because for some years there was a window of opportunity where suddenly evangelicals were free to evangelise. Partly because communists hoped in that way the influence of the Orthodox Church would be eroded. With the collapse of communist regimes, the religious liberty issue has come back, and the confrontation problem is liable to arise again, because Orthodox have often portrayed evangelicals as sectarians. It's a recurrent problem. And so you get textbooks in Russia about the discipline of sectology, one for the curriculum perhaps, Stephen, which would portray evangelicals alongside Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons and so on. And the fourth pattern of engagement has been church planting. If coming alongside the ancient churches was not going to work, then you were going to have to start somewhere new for converts to call their spiritual home. And initially you might do that because it's a practical necessity, but it's only a small step from that to saying, in principle, you need a new church. In principle, those converts must come out. Not just that they have to come out because at the moment there's no hope for them, but actually they have to come out because they should come out. And that has been the most controversial of all the approaches that we're surveying this morning. And in recent decades it's given rise to bitter complaints in Eastern Europe about evangelical activity on what they call orthodox canonical territory. Now, some missionaries adopted this church planting approach from the start, especially the Brethren. I suspect that in a large measure the Baptists may well have done likewise. There are several reasons why some who'd initially followed the coming alongside approach moved over to the church planting approach. Worship was one. And incidentally, I think you've got in parallel development within evangelicalism itself in the 19th century, which sees many evangelicals becoming lower church in their outlook and placing less emphasis on the ordinances, as we used to call them. And so, of course, if they're becoming lower church, they're less likely to be sympathetic to anything that looks high church. Spirituality was another reason why missionaries moved away from the idea of working with the ancient churches, as they struggled to find anyone within those churches who they could be reasonably sure had a living relationship with God through Christ. And then there was the neglect of scripture that they found, because in spite of all the labours of the Bible societies, some of the leaders of these churches condemned the translations produced and distributed by them. And even where the scriptures were being circulated, there didn't seem to be the widespread rethinking and renewing that the missionaries had hoped for as a result. And many missionaries, as they studied the churches among whom they worked, concluded it was simply impossible for the message of the gospel ever to be heard within those systems. In time, too, with eschatology among evangelicals changing, and had the rise of the premillennialist outlook, which says that the second coming takes place before the millennium, and that up to the second coming things in this world will get worse and worse and worse. What that brought was a view of Christendom, East as well as West, which saw institutional Christendom as apostate and doomed, and urged faithful believers to call awakened souls to come out of religious Babylon. Revelation 18:4, and come out from her, my people, lest you share in her plagues. I think, too, there's another reason why missionaries moved to forming separate churches, which we can see with hindsight. The century saw a growing confidence in all things Western. Missionaries weren't free from that sort of cultural imperialism which saw the Western way as the best way. And therefore, Western-style churches would be seen as more efficient than Eastern-style ones. I'll have to jump some stuff that hopefully will appear on the website when I send this in. But if we look most recently, it's worth noting that post-1990, in the fall of communism, the church planting strategy received a massive but not always well-focused boost. You had many Western missionaries entering the former communist world with the conviction that we are taking Jesus to Romania. The fact that he had been there for over a millennium seems to have passed them by. And the surge in mission trips was not always welcomed by evangelicals. I was quite surprised on my visits to various countries in Eastern Europe, just listening to what some Eastern leaders would say about the problems they had with Western input. There's the story of one pastor who, when asked what Western Christians could do to help in his country, offered 3 suggestions. Number 1, pray. Number 2, pray. Number 3, stay away. And even where participants had sought to inform themselves about the religious culture where they would be working, and often they didn't, and that was a recurrent complaint, even where they had tried to inform themselves, their knowledge might well be shaped by what they'd heard about the compromises made under communism, and so on. That perhaps was less of a factor in the Middle East, but throughout the Eastern Christian world, there was the issue of Western missionaries perceiving Eastern Christianity as dead. And it's a view that some of you may share. Then there's the 5th pattern of engagement, conversation. There were some conversations late 16th century, between Lutheran theologians and the Greek Orthodox. But really, this has been very much more a recent phenomenon in the last 30 years, where evangelicals have actually sat down to talk with Eastern Christians. Not with a view to trying to win them over, but with a view to mutual understanding. So you have dialogues between evangelicals and Orthodox. The World Council of Churches saw this beginning when evangelicals and Orthodox expressed concerns about something that was said at one of the General Assemblies of the World Council of Churches in 1991. And these two traditions discovered that they got the same complaints for the same reasons, and that they had got more in common than they realised. And the World Council of Churches very nobly facilitated a dialogue between these two traditions. In Britain, the Evangelical Alliance facilitated the dialogue, the results of which were published in 2001. And then currently you have the Lausanne Orthodox Initiative that I mentioned earlier. But my sense is that within that dialogue, the initial attempts to explore possibilities for theological convergence proved elusive and frustrating. And yet, participants had experienced the reality of fellowship. So they couldn't just write each other off. And it's arguable that a more pragmatic approach has become prominent, which is looking at how we can collaborate more closely in mission, broadly defined. My sixth pattern, very briefly, is cultural appropriation, where evangelicals explore ways in which Christianity can be presented in culturally appropriate forms. Now, over here in the West, that may take certain particular manifestations, but in the East, sometimes it means that evangelical churches actually look very like Orthodox ones, because that is what the culture looks like. And the classic example of this, and you can look it up on the internet, it'll be a shocker, is the Evangelical Baptist Church of Georgia, which adopts major aspects of Orthodox worship and spirituality as part of its enculturation. Iconography, affirmation of monasticism, forms of liturgical worship which are derived from Orthodoxy. And could you imagine going to the average Baptist church in southern England and the main Sunday morning service being a celebration of the Orthodox liturgy of St. John Chrysostom? No. But that's what happens in Georgia. And they have found that that enables them to engage with people in a way that avoids a lot of the evangelicals and foreigners obstacle that might otherwise arise. Of course, Orthodox will say you can't pick a mix, you ought to take Orthodoxy as a package, but the fact remains that this cultural appropriation is being tried. And then a final pattern is cooperation. Back in 1910, at the World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh, there was great controversy because the initial idea was that Catholic and Orthodox countries were going to be treated as unreached. And the Anglicans said, if you do that, we're pulling out. Intense debate took place. It was agreed that we couldn't really treat, South America Catholic, Eastern Europe Orthodox as unreached in that way. That threw up other problems, but what Edinburgh did was to say, okay, proselytism of Christians from the Catholic and Orthodox traditions isn't really where we're at. Oddly enough, though, the idea that the Catholic and Orthodox worlds count as unreached has persisted. At the Lausanne 2010 Congress in Cape Town, a friend of mine who's an Orthodox priest was shattered to hear Orthodox countries described as unreached. And it was conversations at Cape Town between evangelicals and Orthodox which resulted in the Lausanne Orthodox Initiative. Now, following Edinburgh 1910, there was a measure of cooperation between the two, especially with evangelicals who were sort of activists, pragmatists, passionately evangelistic, but not too theological. Now, that sort of cooperation withered as evangelicals became less ecumenical in the mid-century, but there's been a resurgence more recently. Cooperation in such fields, particularly as translation and publishing and social welfare. I think as a rule of thumb, you might say that the more tenuous the link between a project and the worshipping life of local congregations, the easier it is for evangelicals and Eastern Christians to cooperate, because it raises less thorny issues for them. And certain mission agencies are now reshaping their policies so that it focuses on this idea of working in partnership with local churches of both traditions, fostering cooperation on the ground. In conclusion then, I think we can say that ecclesiology has been a significant factor that's determined which of these 7 approaches has been found appropriate. We've talked about the thin red line approach to church history. The true church is persecuted by the institutional church. There's also the issue of, well, is a church with a Baptistic ecclesiology more or less likely to cooperate than a church that baptises infants? Actually, the evidence on that one isn't clear, but it's a question that does need to be asked. But there are also external factors that have shaped which of these patterns has been adopted. Colonial politics would be one. Cultural superiority would be another. And sometimes just the way that the political alignments have been. To give you an example, dialogue between Baptists and the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople was dealt a mortal blow in 1998 by the NATO bombing of Serbia. And as yet, I don't think it's possible for us to evaluate what the implications have been for church relationships of Western involvement in Iraq. Well, I'm going to leave it there, but I would say in conclusion that I don't think we can get to a comprehensive understanding of how these two traditions are related without realising that actually there's a third person sitting at the table who hasn't been talking much. And that's Islam. And I think future study needs to take that into account as well. Well, thank you for your forbearance. I thought I'd see you.
Thank you very much. Which has lots of resonances with contemporary debates, as you hinted at the end, much more widely than just the issue of evangelicals and orthodox alone. So we have 20 minutes or so for questions, and over to you.
You hinted at the Lausanne approach currently, and you've got the dialogue that started and the link to the website.
Yeah.
But just your little comment about Cape Town and the view that actually it's still seen, whether that's just one or two people seeing it as a reaching the unreached, or whether that's a Lausanne approach.
Yeah, I mean the LOI obviously was a post-Cape Town development. Sorry, for the purposes of recording, you will say, that is Lausanne still looking at these people as unreached? And, the LOI initiative, is it going to make a difference to the way Lausanne thinks? I can't speak for the whole of the Lausanne movement. I'm involved with the Orthodox initiative rather than the Lausanne movement itself. And I think that will depend on how well we in the LOI are able to communicate that vision to the rest of the movement. Sorry, that might sound like I'm playing straight back, but I think that's a fair point, that obviously if we are asking folk to change their thinking significantly, then that's got to be done quite carefully, and it takes time. And I think most evangelicals, not just folk in leadership in Lausanne in 2010 or whatever, would have operated with a pretty similar outlook.
Okay, thank you. Other questions?
How would you define unreached? I mean, as the implication is that there are no Christians in that country or area, or is it a percentage? Or
Right, this is a question about how the term unreached is defined. Yes, I'm not in a position to offer you a detailed answer, but I think if you look back to Edinburgh 1910 and the classification of Orthodox and Catholic countries as unreached, it would be to their minds, or to the minds of the sort of non-Anglican Protestant missionaries, that the gospel had not been heard with sufficient clarity for people to be able to make an informed response in those countries to a sufficiently wide extent. one can't quantify that in terms of percentages and so on.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, please.
You mentioned issues to do with soteriology and ecclesiology becoming separated. Do you think there's a possible kind of way forward for that to kind of, on both sides, be better understood and to actually enrich both churches?
Soteriology and ecclesiology separated, would that offer us a way forward?
Not as in would them being separated, as in that specific part of the dialogue. Is that something? What I mean is, you suggested they'd been separated by evangelicals.
Yeah.
So, in terms of in that area, is the difference vast, or is it more perspective between the two churches?
I would say the difference in outlook between the two on the relationship between soteriology and ecclesiology has traditionally it's fluctuated.
Right.
Early 19th century, I think evangelicals tended to have a stronger understanding of the church. If you look back in Baptist history, for instance, that's quite clear. Then you find with the way that mission developed in the 19th century, that the focus seems to have allowed them to make a bigger distinction between soteriology and ecclesiology and to just go all out to save souls. Now, whether that's because let's save as many as we can because the rapture's coming soon, and therefore we can't adopt a long-term strategic approach to mission, that's part of it, but I'm sure there's more. More recently, I think you've got just in contemporary evangelicalism such a wide variety of approaches, haven't you? Because whilst thinkers will talk about the church as God's primary agent for mission, I'm not sure that will necessarily have percolated through to all the sort of little missions that exist. And I'm not sure what proportion of Western evangelicals think ecclesiologically. Sorry, I'm not sure whether I quite answered the question you're asking, and if so, come back to it. But...
Yes.
Do you think that the current crisis with the IS and the Middle East and the kind of very clear persecution of Christians that's happening there, that's going to raise evangelical understanding of Eastern, Middle Eastern Christian?
The current IS crisis, will it raise evangelical awareness of Eastern Christianity?
In a helpful way, do you think it?
In a helpful way. I don't know, because I think to some extent we're dependent on the way that this is reported in the media. But one of the things that I mentioned in the church where I was preaching the other Sunday for intercession was the fact that one of the key cities affected has been Mosul. Now, if you know anything about Mosul, it is a very early centre of Christianity. Very early. We're going right back to the patristic period. And if you look slightly longer term over the last 10 years at what's happened in Iraq, you have seen significant Christian out-migration. I am not sure whether that's grasped as much as it should, in spite of the efforts of certain agencies to bring this before us. And I'm not sure how we have been responding to those people when they have arrived in the West either. And I think that is a significant issue in terms of how we deal, for instance, with the asylum seekers that arrive at Gatwick and so on. So there's two aspects to it, I think. It's how we pray for the situation on the ground there, and how we deal with people when they arrive here.
Thank you.
Tim, you mentioned the sometimes high-profile converts from Evangelical Christianity to Orthodoxy. I just wondered to what extent such people actually now facilitate the dialogue and conversation, or if there's sometimes the zeal of the convert comes into play, where actually the division is almost enhanced. I think of the dynamics, for example, when something like priests are going to Rome, the sense of division is increased rather than the potential for unity.
I think, and I have to be very careful what I say here, I think converts bring a very different dynamic to discussions from those who've been born and brought up in the Orthodox Church, or born and brought up as evangelicals. And converts are happening in both directions. That's what needs to be made. But the thing that's hit the headlines in the West has been converts to Orthodoxy from Western Christianity. Now, some converts will want to rubbish their background because at the moment all they can see is its inadequacies. Others will say, no, this is the ladder I climbed up to get where I am now, and I'm thankful for what God gave me while I was an evangelical. But obviously, a convert is going to approach the question of talking to evangelicals in a different way from somebody who's been born and brought up.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
On the back of that then, can I ask the other way around? You mentioned converts the other way around, from Orthodoxy to evangelicalism. Are there places where they're writing, or places we can look to get there?
Where can we find out about converts from Orthodoxy to evangelicalism? There is very little that's written by them. One of the things that made the evangelical to Orthodoxy conversions very much high profile was that Peter Gilchrist and others were adroit at the use of the media to spread their message. It's an evangelical skill that they consciously brought with them to Orthodoxy when they joined it. You don't have that among the converts from Orthodoxy to evangelicalism. Moreover, it has been argued, although I don't think it's been carefully analysed, that the converts in each direction are not quite of the same calibre. By that, what I mean is, if you look at Western converts to Orthodoxy in the West, typically they will be highly educated and committed. If you look at Orthodox converts to evangelicalism, quite typically they will not have had a serious engagement with their Orthodox faith. They will have been more nominal. That is not always the case. There are exceptions, but by and large it is argued the converts from Orthodoxy were not as committed as the converts from evangelicalism had been, nor had they given the same amount of thought to their faith. And of course then some protagonists will say that means that one direction needs to be taken more seriously than the other. That more analysis needs to be done on that part. But I know of very little, and I've found very few in this country who've been happy to talk or to engage with me on that.
Thank you.
You mentioned Frankie Schaeffer.
Yeah,
Francis
Frank Schaeffer, yeah.
I remember talking with Ranald McCall, Schaeffer's son-in-law, many years ago, and he was talking about the likelihood of ordination of women in the Anglican Church, first as deacons and then as priests, and he was saying that would probably trigger him into becoming Orthodox. And when I said, what about filioque calls, he said, well, that doesn't matter.
Right, yes, this is a question based on a comment from Ranald McCall some years ago about the ordination of women within the Church of England as a trigger point leading to people to convert to Orthodoxy. In fact, that did happen. There was a group of about a dozen Anglican clergy who formed a group in the late 90s called Pilgrimage to Orthodoxy. They eventually were headed by Michael Harper, who was one of them, and they joined the Antiochian Orthodox Church, which was seen as the most outward-looking of the jurisdictions on offer to them. And they have settled within the Orthodox Church. However, I don't think we have seen anything like the quantity of conversions to Orthodoxy that there were to Roman Catholicism, where you had the ordinariate being set up and so on. Partly because I think Orthodoxy is still not seen by many as a Western religious option. Thank you.
I wondered where, in terms of contemporary discussion, some major doctrinal issues come into play. So, for example, in terms of my knowledge of Orthodoxy, which is very limited, it comes almost exclusively from studying the doctrine of the Trinity and the Holy Spirit, where clearly Orthodoxy has a great deal to contribute to the discussion.
Yeah.
And a lot of key Reformed theologians are heavily influenced by the Eastern tradition. I think of people like T.F. Torrance, Colin Gunton, and so forth. So are there any kind of positive things like that which are part of this kind of discussion?
Yes, near the beginning I talked about evangelical interest under the curiosity heading, recent evangelical theological interest in Orthodoxy. And I think that has been quite significant. It's all of the piece with evangelical interest in the theology of people like Tom Torrance and Colin Gunton, and the return to the patristic heritage. And I suppose there is the argument, which I've heard advanced, which it sounds simplistic, but actually has more of a point to it than you realise. A church which gave us the doctrines of the person of Christ and the Trinity can't be all wrong. It has to have something going for it, which is, from one level, breathtakingly condescending of us to say, but on the other hand, does help to open some people up to the idea that Eastern Christian thinkers have got something going for them. And the fact is that the church in which those doctrines were being formulated was also a church in which understanding of Scripture, the role of Mary, the saints, etc. were also being formulated. Now, we've taken some of what they formulated, but not the rest. And how do we develop a nuanced approach that's ready to listen to what they have to say before we pass judgment on it?
Yeah, and relating to that, I mean, I wouldn't attempt to preach on the Trinity without having my big poster of Rublev's icon of the Trinity. And obviously this does mean that I'm presenting an Eastern as opposed to a Western view of the Trinity, which I'm happy to do, along with Torrance and Clement and those kinds of things. And it actually, there are people who can take things on board by looking at the icon in a way that if you just try and explain things in words, they won't get. So I've done this with other icons as well. And I'm just thinking, is this an area where other evangelical people actually see that there are opportunities for presenting the word more effectively because there are these kinds of resources that are available, even if you might not take on board the whole historical aspect of the tradition.
Yes, the question is about, can we make more use of resources such as Rublev's icon of the Trinity and so on. And I think quite a number of evangelicals do. I got it on my study wall, actually. And the Methodist minister where I am has also used it. And in fact, years ago when I was teaching in Moscow, I went to see the original. I just remember sitting there in the gallery in Moscow in front of this icon, just gawping at it for a good long while, even though the place was really busy with people because it was a Sunday afternoon. And I think there are significant things there. I mean, from my own perspective, I tend to be a lot happier with the Eastern understanding of the Trinity than an Augustinian one. However, I wonder how far we connect the Eastern resources to help us in presenting the Trinity with the empirical Orthodox Church from which those resources come. Does using Rubliov's icon of the Trinity mean that we're more likely to try and have a cup of coffee with our local Orthodox priest one Saturday morning? Because we think, well, this church has got something going for it, it might be worth getting to know. To put it very simply.
That seems like a very good place to round off. Thank you very much indeed, Tim, for a fascinating morning. So just say we'll be returning to the theme of orthodoxy in a fortnight with Michael Bordeaux from the Next week we have a professor from America, Thomas Yoder Neufeld, a distinguished professor in the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition, talking about when righteousness and peacemaking, particularly in the New Testament. So we'll see you